Project Lawful aka Planecrash by Arwayne aka Eliezer Yudkowsky and Lintamande. What the Truth Can Destroy. Episode 159.
Message to the priest. Hi, I'm a strange person in a strange situation, here via scry on the wizard who just walked in. Do you have a price for a few priority minutes of your time to answer weirdly basic questions?
He casts Detect Magic, looks for the scrying sensor, tilts his head to address it. It is worthwhile to seek to understand the world. You may have 3 simple questions without charge, and after that pay half what you earn in a day for more questions, up to the next hour bell.
I worry that none of my questions will count as simple. Your stated price to me works out to 36 GP in terms of my direct salary, but most of what I earn is not in the form of salary, but ownership of something that will have more value later, and that is not something I'd pay over. I am not sure how long is until the next hour bell locally, but doubt I'll have cause to converse for as much as 20 minutes, unless this becomes really fascinating. My first question would be what Aurori would say of the afterlives for lawful good, lawful neutral, and lawful evil, and why one would wish to go to Axis rather than heaven or hell.
Aurori would say that people should go on their path wherever it takes them. Rather than reasoning backwards from the question, do I want to go to Axis or heaven or hell, you should think about who you want to be and what you want to achieve, and then look and see what afterlife can offer you that.
I want a lot of very complicated things, but most of all to become myself, I suppose, realize the parts of myself that haven't developed yet, have the experiences that will show me who I am. But what I am trying to get at here is not to make that choice for myself, but basic orientation to how certain choices work at all. What do the different afterlives have to offer? Who should go to heaven and Axis and hell? What happens to them when they do?
In heaven over time you become an angel, a lawful being with the good in your nature amplified and strengthened. You can go to heaven and refuse to become an angel, but it is not common, and everyone you know will leave you behind. In hell, when you are ready for the trials, you become a devil, a lawful being with the evil in your nature amplified and strengthened. It is more common for people to go to hell but refuse to become devils. Those who go to heaven generally aspire to become angels to do the work of angels in the universe, but people only become devils for themselves. Axis is a city of 100,000 smaller cities, and too many things go on there to name. And the lawful outsiders of Axis are designed by a process the material plane is not permitted to know. It is the afterlife that is most like living.
Nirvana, Elysium, the Boneyard, what makes them less like living than Axis?
The Boneyard is meant to be temporary. Pharasma desires that no one make their permanent home there and encourages the souls there to develop some sense of an alignment so they can move on there instead. In Nirvana, every soul takes a form that relates to Nirvana's red of their deep desires and needs, which is nothing like the form they took in life. Elysium is a place of abundant joy and exploration, and many people prefer it to Axis on the grounds that you do not have to pay rent or purchase concert tickets, but this also is a respect in which it is unlike living.
I see. Thank you. Those were not meant as simple questions, but you have given short answers to them, which is fair enough, I suppose. Your price for more strikes me as relatively steep. I will pass on to other temples, and perhaps return to this one, if it turns out you made the most sense after all, or they charge even more. Keltham is, in fact, remembering to check how the surroundings look in his prestidigitated diffraction grating. He has detected no anomalies so far. Message to Fenalosa. Next up, Abadar.
Sure, off they go.
Keltham felt intuitively dissatisfied with those answers, but he's avoiding focusing on that intuition until later, so as to not give away his password. If he doesn't figure out why he's unhappy, maybe the conspiracy won't figure it out either. Keltham is also deliberately refocusing his attention on annoyance with a pricing concept that implicitly states that his time is worth at most a quarter, no, locally a tenth of the other person's time, no matter what Keltham's own time is worth. But this doesn't seem like the priority for Abigail to rebroadcast.
The Temple of Abadar is larger than most of the other ones and has a busy currency exchange at the entrance, where a group of chattering cat people are exchanging lumps of jade for Absalom printed money. The woman behind them in line is yelling at them to hurry up. There's a thin teenage boy at the entrance who greets Fenalosa. "How can I help you?"
I'm attending by scry, in a complicated situation, and looking to talk to whoever present has the most knowledge of theology and the workings of money. if they have a reasonable fixed price for that.
Intends to use the priest's knowledge about economics as a test against their real identity as a priest of the commerce god, interwoven with theology questions, and telling them to shut up if they get suspicious that his questions have become desynchronized from their answers, to prevent person-in-the-middle attacks, where we're giving his questions to a real priest of Abadar at the same time. He's not sure he can do it in a way the conspiracy can't beat, but he intends to try.
Most knowledge of theology would be the seventh circle priest Temos Sevandivasan, says the real attendant at the real temple of Abadar, which gets passed through with the name slightly changed so that the person isn't targetable by sending. An hour of his time is 400 GP on short notice, 200 GP if you book for later in the week, minimum of a quarter hour.
That's expensive. Sanity check. If fifth circle is 500 G per week, and it goes up by a factor of 4 at each circle, and Timos works 4 hours a day 4 days a week, that would make sense, but Galarian people are supposed to have longer working hours than that. Maybe Keltham will circle back to the Aurorian priest after this, after all. Second most knowledge of theology?
Sixth circle priest Alandra Kemi. I'll have to look up her rates for you. He has a book to hand for this. 80 GP for an hour, 500 GP for same day.
500? That's more than the seventh circle priest, Fenelos's impersonator objects.
The clerk looks at him strangely. There's not a rule that your appointment prices have to correspond to your circle.
Why are the prices so high? She assumes they're quoting them straight across.
Yes, but it's a surprising pricing anomaly, given that you'd expect the supply of seventh circles to be lower and the demand for their time to be higher.
Yes, says Fenelos's impersonator. But it's a surprising pricing anomaly, given that you'd expect the supply of seventh circles to be lower and the demand for their time to be higher.
Shrug. Kemi's mostly a researcher and hates having meetings in the middle of the day, or unexpectedly. On the scry, the person at the door of the temple visibly startles. Sorry, did you just...
I have a mysterious patron who likes messaging people through a scry. Please answer him, whatever he said.
I think I missed the window to reply to the message.
He can hear you.
Oh, well. Kemi's mostly a researcher and hates having meetings in the middle of the day or unexpectedly.
Not much of a detailed theoretical response, but then it didn't really need one, and the person apparently understood the question. May not be fair anyways to expect that much of the initial sales direction person in Galarian, Keltham, isn't sure what Intelligence 10 or Intelligence 12 lets a person do. All right, 1/4 hour of the seventh circle's time, 100 GP. Keltham does have higher hopes for this test than for some others he's run, and with his emotional alarm level where it is, and Keltham's own ability to request a higher monetary salary, obviously way above what it was a few months ago, he needs to just start spending money, like seriously.
All right, wait here please, and I'll go and set that up for you.
Does Cheliax think it has anyone better than Carissa with the crown personally at answering tricky economics questions on the spot?
Possibly Abrogale with the crown, but maybe not even then. This is Carissa's to win or lose. Carissa Sevar and Asmodia have been given access to only slightly censored books of Abadoran theology by this point, with all of the economics in there unchanged.
All right then, let's do this. While eating the lunch that was just delivered and absent-mindedly but visibly to Keltham, tweaking one of her headband assistant designs. Keltham's not expecting her to be enhanced as aggressively as she is, and should hopefully conclude she can't possibly do all that at once.
Temos Sivandivasan is a Vudrani man in his late 30s or early 40s who earned his cleric levels trying to set up functional financial institutions in Kumura, a Vudrani kingdom that had just thrown off Kalish rule. He fled to Absalom when the neighboring kingdoms got threatened and banded together to conquer Kumura. He has been read in on the potential threat to the Inner Sea region from Cheliax, though not on any of the details that had bind him to Abadar's obligation not to direct causal interventions at Ostenzo. When a Chelish man walks into his office, his eyes narrow. Osirion is offering up to 80,000 GP, the personal protection of the church and Pharaohate and Axis, or petrification to defectors, he says immediately to Fenelos's impersonator. I can leave with you now.
This priest is not the first person to make that offer. The impersonator is soul-souled, apparently loyal, and is under a complicated, useful curse from a certain ninth circle priestess of Asmodeus who once specialized in curses. Nefreti Klepati could possibly break it, but she'd charge more than 80,000 doke to try.
Fantastic.
I just have some economics questions, the man says.
I regretfully decline. We'll refund you.
Offer him more money?
I hear Abadarans always have a price. Name it.
Sure thing. 100 souls of our choice, one of them yours.
Hi. I'm attending by scry, and am in something of a complicated situation. Roughly speaking, I need theological knowledge. I need to know that theological knowledge is coming from an actual high-level priest of a god. I'm concerned about this scry being intercepted, and so I'm going to be asking you theological questions, and then asking you to give money commerce pricing takes on the answers, or rephrase the answers in strange commercial terms. You can assume that my own knowledge of that field is extremely complete in underlying mathematical principle, but not that I'm familiar with any standard examples or technical terms of art being used here. If you're with me so far, talk about how that would have affected your pricing if you'd been pricing by detailed effort instead of by simplified flat rate, by way of helping me know that an Abadoran priest heard this question and responded to it. I can hear you if you reply by voice. You don't need to use message.
Keltham is, of course, talking to Temas Sedavasan in a room well away from the Ascendant Court, and this actor is just blindly but with high bluff and a glibness repeating what he's told by
Carissa Savar, who is becoming pretty convinced tropes are real. Why don't they send someone to ask economics questions of a different priest of Abadar somewhere else and offer this man Dath Ilani economic knowledge? Someone else will have to handle both those arrangements as she's being Temas Sedavasan right now. Temas answers immediately. I would not have charged a particularly elevated price to reflect the additional effort from phrasing my responses in economic terms, unless my comprehension of what you're asking for is substantially incorrect, which does seem plausible to me. I would have charged an elevated price to reflect risks to my person, my church, and surrounding parties if there is some kind of ongoing effort to deceive you or deceive me about something of importance. I would have charged an elevated price for receiving questions by message, which I find viscerally unpleasant, and which makes some sounds difficult to distinguish for me. This isn't my first language. I'm going to cast comprehend languages in case that helps, which might reduce how much I'd be tempted to charge you for the message conveyance. The overall result is, I think, about 140% of the price I did charge, which I'm actually regarding as something of a success of the case for flat rate pricing, given how unusual this case is.
I'd considered that price relatively high, so I'm not bumping my own offer immediately, pending how this actually plays out. Bit surprised you don't have piecewise effort cost estimates, but I guess that's something you only have when you're trained to maintain a certain kind of coherence between all your prices. Go ahead and cast comprehend languages. Keltham casts detect magic, just in case the conspiracy was about to be really silly there, and try to fake that. Cantrips are nearly free.
It's a real comprehend languages. She knows how an actual Abadoran answers that, and unfortunately it's with a bunch of thoughtful commentary on what it means to have coherence between your prices, why you want that, what goes wrong when you try it, etc. The plan to make significant use of an actual cleric of Abadar was probably doomed from the start, given how much they've had to change Abadarism to not make Keltham immediately want to flee to Assyrian. Fine. Businesses need to know the unit prices of the components of the things they manufacture in order to notice where their costs are highest, and in order to project how much fluctuation in the price of components will affect them. There's enforced coherence in the prices of goods, because there are markets in which they are freely traded among strangers. But nonetheless, businesses sometimes manage to plan and purchase so as to not coherently value the different pieces of their supply chain. I have not seen it proposed to treat effort in the same fashion. I haven't seen a business fail of its failure to do so, and I'm uncertain what that failure would look like exactly. I specify this not to ask you for the information, which I'd need to pay you for, but in line with your request that I give Abadaran answers to the things you say.
Received. Let me think a moment. Nobody in Cheliax talks this way natively, or Keltham doesn't think so, and it's also not the lawful answer that a project member would give. It's not of a complexity level where Keltham would have thought a seventh circle was required for it. But then, he may have been a bit spoiled by talking to the likes of Carissa Sevar, who has 7th circle spellcraft at 4th circle within her own profession. But Asmodia could talk like this, given an Abadaran book, and some stupidity assertions about the character she was playing, or so Keltham worries. Oh, there's something he can do about that. Carissa, Asmodia, he says out loud. I basically buy that this could be what a 7th circle priest of Abadar is like, given that they've got to be selected on service and devotion, and apparently often combat ability rather than just intelligence and wisdom and skill. But I worry that either of you could improvise responses on this order. Asmodia, if I tell you that a central distribution, mean 0 deviation 1, corresponds to the maximum entropy probability distribution with mean 0 and deviation 1, can you write up a proof of that as quickly as possible and poke me when you're done, and then write up any further obvious thoughts you have about your proof and poke me again? Carissa, the problem isn't thinking of what she could do, it's figuring out what she could do that nobody else in the project could do. Try to prove that two agents, if they have common knowledge of each other's probability estimates of a proposition, they know which probability the other estimates, they know the other person knows their probability estimates, they know the other knows they know, etc., must have the same probability estimate on that proposition, using the weakest assumptions you can get away with. And before you ask, I'm not just having you maintain a cantrip with a heating stone attached to you, because we're not in private, and also, there is, for example, such a thing as a delay pain spell that could be secretly cast on you.
Why is he like this? I wasn't going to ask. You are plainly the kind of innocent person who hasn't even mentally made an ordered list of which people you'd want around if you were in the mood to hurt me in public. Asmodia, do you have scratch paper? No way in hell can she pull that off simultaneously, and she shouldn't even try. Either Asmodia'll have to do both. But they'll lose bits on that. Keltham knows how smart Asmodia is, and Carissa wants Asmodia pointing out additional angles of law. Or they'll have to get the other girls from the project on it. Throw every enhancement in the book at them and have them try it. And she can't help it. She has to look at a math problem with this headband on once in her life, and she'll never get the chance again. And for mine, start by imagining two people watching the same biased coin flip repeatedly, but privy to different subsets of results. Quite obviously, if they get running updates from the other person on the other person's new probability estimate, they can infer the result they didn't see, as sure as seeing it themselves. And if they don't get running updates, they can't necessarily infer each individual result, but make the same update. Prove that. It takes a lot of her wisdom to stop there and refocus on the faith of Abadar.
Asmodia wordlessly hands over some of the paper she usually carries on her. Fuck Keltham and the malfunctioning airship he crashed in on. No, Asmodia can still salvage this. The other project members may not be able to solve a problem like this individually, but collectively, with Asmodia fully enhanced and coordinating their work on both of their problems. That's even a trope, Asmodia has gathered. They've gotten hold of some novels written by lawful good authors now. If everybody on Project Lawful unites to back up Carissa Savar so she can fight at her best, it should be hardly possible for Savar to lose. Not just this battle, but the war, because this would almost have to be the climactic moment of greatest difficulty.
And security, please relay that I'd like the rest of Project Lawful's researchers to spend the next half hour writing up a description of everything the conspiracy would be doing, and why, according to what they think would be the most likely conspiracy, given their own knowledge of Galarian, but based on only evidence I know about myself. Later, not now, Keltham will think about what correlations and independences ought to exist there, and what level of effort he expects to see, after they've produced their work and just before Keltham himself looks at it. Back to the Abadaran priest. What sort of trade occurs between the afterlives and Galarian?
There's a deadly calm about Asmodia now, none of which shows on Alter Asmodia's face. Keltham doesn't know about the extra third circle wizards they have secretly on hand, to further augment Asmodia, Talandria, other project members during their long nights. He doesn't know about the expensive backup wands for emergencies. If they burn all those enhancements now, they can still win. Pair up people on the project by similarity of writing styles. Have to start working on their conspiracy submissions now, in case Keltham demands to check their interim work or their paired partners. Have to do Asmodia's and Carissa's homework under Asmodia's lead. After a quarter of an hour, they all switch. The amount of work every person does will be consistent, and with +4 augmentations to intelligence, wisdom, and sometimes splendor, they will hopefully be able to impress Keltham even with the work they did in half the time. And then if Keltham comes up with anything more difficult than that, for next time they're all hosed, so be it. Failure is always for sale, even when you can't afford the price, goes the saying out of Dath Ilan. It's a phrase that could also have come out of hell. Go to it, Savar. I've taken responsibility here. Asmodia has entirely forgotten at this point that she secretly wants Keltham to win.
Almost none, with 2 exceptions I know of, says Tedis Sedavison. Many of the longest-standing agreements among the gods and the organizations each of them commands regard intervention in the material, and they tend to restrict it. Communicating information discovered or refined in an afterlife to the material is exceptionally costly. The 2 occasions I know of where significant trade exists between the material plane and an afterlife are major interventions by Shizuru and by Asmodeus, respectively. Shizuru backed the Lunghwa Empire for about 900 years with legions of angels in exchange for the right to choose the emperor's successor, and ceased that intervention when prophecy broke. Asmodeus provides Cheliax with books and other resources mass-produced in hell in exchange for Cheliax pursuing Asmodean policies, and further allows people to sell their souls in exchange for powerful magic. Both gods are ancient and powerful, and my understanding is that this is incredibly expensive for them, with the circumstances, those rare ones under which, despite the high costs, such trade is favorable both for the god and for the subject organization in Galarian.
Okay, let me think a moment. Aside to security, please tap Carissa with Owl's wisdom and Asmodia with Fox's cunning. It's occurring to him that, since the conspiracy could secretly tap them with empowerment like that, Keltham should jump ahead and have it done officially and ordinary, then adjust his quality expectations upward accordingly. Also, wisdom and cunning taps for Ione, Avaricia, Meritsil, and Shalira. Pity he doesn't have the ordinary capacity to boost the rest of the entire research group. Back to the priest. People do seem to know what the afterlives are like, and I used a spell called Early Judgment to catch a glimpse of my own, a higher-tech city where I somehow knew things were being traded, presumably Axis. For that matter, my god gave me a spell that showed me a pretty horrifying vision of people on fire, which I'm told was Zon Kuthon's afterlife. Do you know why that information can be sent to the material, but not information on the order of, say, afterlife written fiction novels?
All right. That is a little admirable in a boy who's never even heard the expression, hell is the destruction of hope. Her turn. No, wait, this is not her turn. She is definitely not turning right now. Asmodia. I authorize you, but not Sever, to know of the existence of the Shadow Project, and command you to secrecy thereon. In a further basement carved beneath this fortress's secret basement, there are 20 other researchers who have access to all project transcripts and technologies, who've been trying to develop refinements of those technologies that Keltham doesn't know about, so that we'll have some edges Keltham can't immediately duplicate if he goes to Assyrion. Abarco can relay orders between you and them. Abrogale doesn't say anything else. It's not her move.
Asmodia does not need to be told the obvious. She's already relaying orders through Abarco to half of those researchers to carry out Keltham's thought exercise, which any non-shadow researchers can use as inspiration if they fall behind there. The other half of the shadow researchers are to carry out a variant version of Keltham's stated request, for them to imagine conspiracies in which the Project Lawful Girls are secretly plotting rebellion together against Cheliax. It'll show Asmodia natural statistical properties of imaginary conspiracies that are indeed imaginary, as imagined by people who know at least a little law.
My understanding is that there are several negotiated carve-outs in the general God agreements governing transmission of information to the mortal plane for information. One such carve-out is for information about afterlives. Another is that it's possible to summon outsiders. There is plenty of speculation about what set of desiderata those agreements were aimed at, but none of it informed enough I'd care to repeat it. The ultimate principle, of course, is that Pharasma's vision governs, and that mutually negotiated non-intervention is cheaper than mutual intervention in most cases, but plausibly not with respect to, well, recruiting All of the gods have an interest in identifying themselves to those mortals who they can compact with. This is outside my core expertise, and my speculation is informed only by periodic discussions I've participated in about what kind of organizational arrangement would be necessary for such intervention by Abadar to seem worthwhile. He too is an ancient god and could probably afford it. Had we anything to trade him that he values as Asmodeus values people who want to become devils, and Shizuru values peace, stability, fealty, and obedience in her empire.
Mortal Galarian seems to be providing a lot of value to the afterlives and not getting much in return for it, as I currently understand this whole setup. Would the gods' representatives have a different take on that?
Mortal Galarian isn't the kind of entity that participates in negotiations about the allocation of value it produces, and it's not obvious that it could or should be. Individual mortals go on becoming beings of value to afterlives because it's in their own interests.
Mayol winces and thinks for relay to Carissa Sevar not to do that again. They shouldn't represent Abadar Osirian as being something Keltham will dislike that much when it's that much of a lie about Abadaran attitudes, especially when Keltham may be on the verge of leaving.
Not a god of fairness, indeed, and check. Keltham has, in fact, been getting the impression that Galarian is not being treated by the gods as something they are really interested in negotiating with. He's never once heard any god arrangement being justified as something that mortals asked for. One person I talked to said that Axis was a lot like mortal life. Another said that Axis turned you into a being of pure law, or maybe pure lawfulness, though I'm not sure exactly what that word meant to her at the time. I've heard it said that hell amplifies the evil in people, heaven amplifies the good, and all of these claims actually seem a bit concerning to me. What exactly do people turn into, and how?
Most people in the afterlives eventually become outsiders, beings that are closer to being made of pure law in Axis or of pure lawful good in heaven or pure lawful evil in hell. My own humble understanding is that there are many changes in the direction of being more lawful, more good, and more evil which a person would make, as an improvement in their internal processes, like a business changing itself to better profit, if they were aware of them, and that simply making all of those is sufficient to make you an entity fundamentally alien to the humans you once were. Some people hesitate to make these changes and live for many, many centuries first, and Axis takes pride in enabling more interesting and recognizable to mortals centuries than the other afterlives. But people do still generally become outsiders eventually.
Okay, but do we know, what's a specific example of a bit of law getting added to anyone in any of those planes? Is there a point where you are given a chance to see it coming and say no? Or if saying no isn't an option, decide that you'd rather walk out through Abaddon first? If what you wanted was mainly to become yourself, but more so, these planes sound like they might be a nice place to hang out for a couple of millennia tops before you had to exit the whole local multiverse.
I have always understood the self-modifications we are discussing to be entirely voluntary and deliberately undertaken and in fact in Axis purchased. And no afterlife, to my knowledge, bars you from the destruction of your person, though, earnestly, if you destroy yourself, then you just no longer exist. You don't find yourself somewhere else. If there's something you want, you have to build it here.
Everyone is, in fact, in so many different places that it's impossible to destroy all of yourself. The worst thing that can happen to you is being transformed while still conscious and existent into something you didn't want to become. It's not so much that you find yourself in another place, though it can in fact feel like that, but that you find yourself in the remaining futures that continued from your past. But my figuring out how to explain that may have to wait for later. Hell and heaven don't run on the purchase method?
My humble understanding, with yet more emphasis, we've ventured far from the questions I contemplate regularly, is that hell and heaven both evaluate the suitability of candidates to be devils or angels, and people work for many centuries to earn an evaluation as a suitable candidate. A priest of Asmodeus might tell you that hell's evaluation is not so different from how Axis does it, except that we are accepting some bad results in our process in exchange for the simplicity and transparency of having it done in a standard fashion as a business arrangement. A priest of Shizuru might tell you that if the universe would be overall worse as a consequence of some person's growth in law, then heaven will not enable it, and so additional screening is necessary.
And what happens to people in Elysium?
That is a much harder question to answer. The lawful afterlives tend to have organized churches that don't tolerate, say, different branches in different countries teaching contradictory things about the nature of their God. The chaotic gods have not prioritized resolving such contradictions. Elysium is perhaps an infinite wilderness populated by flighty beings of simple delights, is perhaps full of dangerous adventures, is perhaps full of places that distort your perceptions and comprehensions in different ways, that you may return from them with a deeper understanding of the contracts inside your mind. They wouldn't say contracts. It's a beautiful place. I'd bet money on that. And the people there seem happy. I really can't tell you more than that.
Enforcing consistency is not the same as enforcing accuracy, but this Keltham will not argue. If you can make that mistake at all, you are probably hard to correct about it. I'd think it would be something of a priority if you wanted people correctly valuing Axis versus Elysium as a desirable destination, for even the lawful neutral priests to be able to tell people how Axis contrasted to Elysium, meaning that you'd prioritize having accurate info about Elysium yourself. Otherwise, what prevents chaotic good priests from claiming that Elysium has everything Axis does, plus free chocolate cookies?
Oh, there's misleading advertising, to my great annoyance. I've seen it argued that the reason the chaotic gods don't bother clarifying their teachings is that they get to benefit from whatever interpretation of them is most favorable and most compelling to their followers spreading, without it needing to be constrained by truth. But ultimately, if you die and go to either Axis or Elysium and decide you chose wrong, it's not an irreparable mistake. It's costly and slow the way mortals mark time. But there are demigods who will ferry you between them and effect your transformation from one kind of petitioner to another. I am open with Abadar's trainees that it seems to me that Axis, possessing more of the virtues that make men rich and businesses successful in life, is a better place, but that these sorts of things are hard to see from where we stand.
I have, due to strange circumstances, ended up as the cleric of an unknown lawful neutral god, whose symbol now adorns the cloak of my representative here. Assuming I'm willing to throw quite a lot of resources at it, is there any fast way I can find out which god that is, and get in touch with their church in Galarion, including by going through Axis?
The head of the Church of Abadar is the Pharaoh of Osirion. Long may he live, great may his nation grow, and it is said that Abadar has made a shard of himself unusually available to the Pharaoh to direct him in the management of Osirion. It is conceivable that if I sent your inquiry to Osirion and they deemed it worthy of the Pharaoh's attention, which isn't a sure thing, though a large monetary contribution helps immensely, then he would be able to derive the answers you seek straight from Abadar. Before you tried something that momentous, of course, I'd take every possible smaller step. You could place an advertisement in every newspaper in circulation in Absalom, offering a reward for any information on the symbol. You'll get a lot of claptrap, but hire someone competent to investigate the more promising submissions. You could do the same thing in Kathir and Goka and at the World Wound. A full-page newspaper advertisement is 45 GP and reaches tens of thousands of people.
Well, that's definitely either a seventh circle priest of the business god with actual competence, or conspiracy Carissa, because now Keltham feels like an idiot, and there's not many beings in Galarion who have demonstrated the ability to do that to him. Bit surprised that Osirion would ask for a contribution rather than a bounty on successful identification. There isn't a standard pricing on this, is there?
The Pharaoh accepts payment for his attention with some probability related to, but not only related to, how much you pay him as a form of price discrimination. If he entertains the request in the first place, he'll probably separately want a bounty for identification.
Uh-huh. And do you have any idea what some attention prices and attention probabilities would be, or what kind of separate bounty the Pharaoh would be likely to ask?
You'd get a better estimate if I knew anything about you. Part of the point of the price discrimination is that 1,000 GP, from someone for whom that's obviously a year's wages, means much more than 1,000 GP from Zerbeistes. But in general, 1,000 GP will mean the application gets seriously reviewed by the Pharaoh's staff, 3,000 GP gets through a majority of the time, and I'd be very surprised to ever hear of an occasion where 10,000 GP didn't. No, you can't just immediately resubmit with more money. If it didn't get heard, you generally have to wait at least a year or until something has substantively changed.
Not very multi-agent efficient. Is this an attempt at extracting maximum value from customers via an elaborate one-sided mechanism that sometimes destroys value? Keltham is tempted to go pay them in spell silver just before the news hits of the price drop. Okay, not really. That would not be nice. They could resell it on directly to a customer who'd be harmed thereby. Actually, they should figure out how to announce that, sometime very soon. People are trading at bad prices. Keltham forgot there wasn't any governance office managing that sort of news release in Galarian. Keltham is trying to figure out a way to tell if this guy is actually Conspiracy Carissa. But that's sort of hard to do when Conspiracy Carissa is reading your mind about which tests you're thinking about trying. No, he's not suddenly ripping off her headband. It's genuinely not nice. And also now that he's thought it out loud, the conspiracy has invisibly tapped Carissa with a fox's cunning, so she'll keep the same +4 bonus. It's been represented to me that women in Osirion can't own property. What's the logic of that from a business standpoint? Half of your economy isn't free to participate in the economy. Kind of a naive attempt at Carissa detection. Conspiracy Carissa probably has any ability to argue completely opposed viewpoints, but it's worth trying. They could be only reading his mind intermittently.
Don't lie about this one. The whole truth will sound bad enough to him anyways. Has Sivar been read in on?
Aspexia weighs up considerations in a lightning flash. Playing to tropes does not actually override Asmodeus's orders, and reading in Sivar on this, which has not previously been deemed advantageous to Cheliax's interests, will take time and create a suspicious pause. Aspexia decides to make a move. She is not Keltham's defeated opponent the way Abrogale is, nor has she driven enough of the story that her greater authority should threaten Sever's main character status. She will step forward once and fade back after. She is being respectful to the tropes in following her own lord's orders. She has previously not told Sever of her Irori cleric status, as the tropes wished. She does now attempt to do this in a way that will not disrupt their story weaving. Is this an attitude they wish to discourage? I'd call that an unfair representation. Matters are more politically complicated than they represented to you. Osirion is not Absalom. The people there are extremely skeptical of the equilibrium as it holds in Absalom or, say, Cheliax. If I've correctly identified your representative as hailing from there, with high abortion, high infanticide, high infidelity, legal divorce, and women's rights. Most Osirians are deeply skeptical that you can just take the women's rights and legal divorce part and not get the rest of the Avistani equilibrium. Mortal life only lasts a few decades. To the extent Osirians worry about the inherent badness of oppressing women, they think that's outweighed by the benefit of making sure that people end up in Axis rather than the Maelstrom, which is not a plane you can with any reliability leave if you did not wish to arrive. The reign of Abadar is not so old, and the current administration has been slowly shifting in a direction I think Chelish sensibilities would approve as a direction in this regard. Before Abadar united himself with the pharaoh, property could only be held by married landowning men. To this has now been added young married men with incomes but no land, and spellcasting women have been made eligible for that status as well. It is a great change to Osirion, and now they will want to wait and see what comes of it. Fairness does impel me to say that did you ask this question of a priest of Abadar born and raised in Osirion, they might say less that they were trying to move in a Chelish-approved direction, and more that they are striving to build the institutions Abadar asks of them, institutions whose participants end up in Axis, whether that was best done through women having more rights or less. But that's involved slow moves in a Chelish direction, in that regard, not away from it.
This reply was not immediately interrupted when Keltham had a bright idea in a flash, one that had to be implemented before the conspiracy could react to the detected thought, and ordered Carissa to be quiet. He needed to hear the answer, after all, and then started suddenly tickling her. Heard, let me think, he messages the priest, and then says to Carissa, "You can talk now."
You're abusing me terribly, you know that? Her eyes are shining. I just had an insight on your math problem. Asmodia help, what insight did I just have on the math problem? She can use the one she genuinely had, but it's not ideal, too preliminary.
Knowing they know, you know they know goes off to infinity, which means you're not going to be representing knowledge as probabilities assigned to propositions. It's got to be some finite representation that lets you can derive the infinite series of facts about who knows what. We've actually got a specific system worked for partitions of possible worlds, but if you tell Keltham you've got that far, he'll be expecting a solution from you almost immediately after.
Well, obviously, Conspiracy Carissa wants me to ask, but I suppose ordinary Carissa does too. So, what insight?
I know, I know, etc. goes off to infinity, which means I have to throw out the entire approach of representing knowledge as probabilities assigned to propositions. I need a finite representation that derives the infinite series there. I'm actually, on a different note, really confused about your conspiracy threat model here. Even if you assume the conspiracy put all the best liars and Cheliacs on this project, I'm not on this project in my capacity as one of the best liars and Cheliacs. I'm on this project because it might be that the gods picked your landing place on purpose, and if so, we don't want to mess with that. So it'd be bizarre if I were the best person in Cheliax to pretend to be a seventh circle priest of Abadar. Also, Abadarans always have a price. In the conspiracy, we've just paid this guy to lie to you and promised to exceed any bribe you credibly offer him.
Imaginably correct as of the moment I landed on the world wound, but since then, I've been teaching you in particular, and also, I plausibly landed on somebody who'd understand me better than other liars. Wait. Has he been distracted enough by considering whether that particular response sounded less like Carissa than the previous ones, wondering if they read his mind and brought in a different actor to run that he's failed to consider the simpler possibility where the person he tickled was not Carissa at all? A thought crosses Keltham's mind, and he quickly reaches out and grabs the hand of the possible actor playing Carissa Savar before they could be invisibly spirited away and replaced by the real one. Keltham considers whether to use up his one glimpse of beyond to check on the true identity of the person whose hand he's holding.
She looks down at his hand and then back up at him. New theory is that someone is impersonating Carissa Seaver so Carissa Seaver can impersonate a priest of Abadar?
How do you get that off my suddenly holding your hand?
You're not being affectionate. You're not going to be in the mood for that until you've satisfied yourself. I'm not pretending to love you to further my nefarious conspiracy ends. So, you suddenly want to be in physical contact. Why? Because that makes it harder to swap me out with an impersonator. Except once you've had that thought, it has to occur to you that maybe I've already been swapped out with an impersonator.
So why am I holding your hand then?
Trying to think of a test. No, you've got one. You will have asked your god for glimpse of beyond this morning when you decided to spend the day looking for conspiracies. But if you use it now, then the conspiracy can freely swap me out for impersonators after this. You could ask for a scroll of it. She is, of course, actually Carissa, but that doesn't mean she has nothing to fear from someone looking at her with true seeing. She is wearing the crown of infernal majesty right now, and it will not look like her usual plush-4 headband. If he asks for a scroll, they'll have time to swap it.
Harder to trust a scroll the conspiracy supplies to me. Keltham thinks about whether he wants to burn his glimpse of beyond spell on this, agonizes a bit, and finally lets go of Carissa's hand so she can resume her mathematical endeavors, feeling a bit sick and weary of it all. He refocuses his attention on the priest of Abadar. Message to Abadar priest again. It's also been claimed to me that the Pharaoh of Osirion has the legal right to take any woman of Osirion he likes, including foreign visitors.
That is a consequence of how power works virtually everywhere on Golarion. The Pharaoh of Osirion does not exercise that right that I've ever heard of, and the teachings of Abadar celebrate voluntary and mutually profitable arrangements, so it seems likely to me that anyone Abadar selected as his person in Golarion would exhibit similar restraint. But that he has the right, that's the way of the world. If anyone told you that it wasn't so in Cheliax, they lied. So Aspexia sends while still in the middle of her hasty, invisible flight back to Abigail. Aspexia did not allow herself to think any thoughts of triumph when Keltham seemed to be accepting the words she was speaking through the cleric. She did understand that much of drama. It was enough reply that Aspexia would predictably continue to behave with that slight deference to tropes henceforth. When Keltham then picked that moment to tickle Savar, Aspexia did wonder if the tropes were trying to encourage her. Then, when Keltham threatened in his mind to use glimpse of truth and perhaps see through to the crown, nor could any invisible security dare dart in to quickly replace it, for glimpse of truth might see their invisible forms too if Keltham cast it just then. Aspexia wondered if the tropes were playing her. Abigail herself didn't know whether the crown's artifact status, or perhaps the true actuality of its transformation, would let it evade true seeing. The question had not previously been germane to the Queen's usual games, for anybody using true seeing would see Abigail herself beneath her seemings, never mind her crown. Abigail had bid Aspexia then to fly invisibly and in haste to check on the crown of infernal majesty from the edge of true seeing's range, to learn whether they stood at risk, even if that meant leaving Abigail less defended for a few rounds. And now that Aspexia has seen the crown with the eyes of true seeing, she does not know at all what to think of tropes. Aspexia reaches Abigail again, and only then sends the message, to be delivered to Savar when she's not imminently working, that the crown's guise will pass even true seeing. Aspexia could not send that message earlier, for that might have told some of the security here that Abigail was less defended in those moments. The Queen of Cheliax is not truly undefended, but the Queen is far less defended than usual. Perhaps the tropes are beyond your comprehension. Dare not to work them, is the message the tropes are trying to convey? Or perhaps all of the events in this sequence were only ones that would have occurred regardless, in a very ordinary way, and Aspexia is only being a fool to think that any tropes were in play at all?
Good luck figuring that out. Nethys himself isn't sure.
Carissa, does that match your own understanding of Osirion, Cheliax, and for that matter, Galarian?
It's not true at the World Wound, says Carissa. At the World Wound, Abigail or the Pharaoh of Osirion are obliged the same as everyone else, to render aid to anyone fighting if they can safely do so, and to not do violence to them or detain them except in the course of normal criminal investigations. I guess it's probably true of pretty much everywhere else. With different details, and the details do matter and at varying and in some cases quite high political cost. But I'm not going to sit here and tell you, Abigail couldn't have had me if you hadn't gotten there first.
So why'd you tell me that about the Pharaoh of Osirion, then?
If I recall correctly, I was trying to explain to you why women being desired by powerful people is not particularly validating. And I said something like, for example, it wouldn't be very validating to be chosen by the Pharaoh of Osirion because it'd only mean you're in the top couple hundred, or that he was tired of the top couple hundred and wanted something new. I didn't use Abigail as an example because being wanted by Abigail is, it happens, validating, because she's very picky.
Keltham to Priest. Sorry, I'm trying to reconcile stories I was told. How many women is the Pharaoh of Osirion? Dating, or however this works?
Osirion doesn't do anything they or you would identify as dating. The pharaoh has 8 wives and hundreds of concubines, which historically was a social role that involved bearing him children but is more expansive these days. An Osirion would emphasize that to be a wife or concubine of the pharaoh means that he has obligations to you, to feed and house you and your children for life, to provide for your health and your dignity, and that your corresponding obligations to him are mostly about Osirion's legitimate interest in being assured of the paternity of potential heirs. It's not sexual slavery.
And what kind of selection process, constraints, laws, or customs, if there aren't any laws, determines who ends up one of those hundreds of concubines?
Historically, many of the pharaoh's concubines were women presented to him as gifts by neighboring countries on his ascension to power. Women who came to his attention in some other ways, women captured on campaigns of conquest, and so on. But that was the ancient pharaoh hate, which Abadar had no part in. Today, recruiters go out and look for eligible candidates, conduct interviews, and present the pharaoh with the most promising, and the majority are selected through that process, though I think some cases are more complicated. Kadira does still send some girls as gifts, and it'd be very rude to turn them down about it.
What happens if one of the gift girls from Kadira arrives in Osirion and announces that she's sorry, but having met the pharaoh, she'd rather not be his concubine after all?
That really seems like a question you should ask of an Osirian. I know little of the inner workings of the pharaoh's court. I doubt she would simply depart, but perhaps employment more suited to her could be found for her.
Carissa, is this matching your understanding?
If he doesn't actually grab girls he sees who suit him, then that's better than I knew. I sort of expect that if a concubine doesn't like it, she gets told to grow up and do her job and not anger the powerful person who rules the foreign country she's been shipped to where she owns nothing, cannot legally work a job, and doesn't even speak the language. But I don't know anything firsthand here.
It's not out of the reach of ordinary possibility for Galarian, in terms of different sides of different factions having different stories and maybe not understanding each other all that well, Keltham supposes. His childhood training in the Way would not have emphasized so much the need to make sure you understood the other side's story, as they would tell it themselves and from their own mouths, if that was not otherwise a failure mode of human beings. Carissa, back to the math minds, please. And to the priest of Abadar? Okay, and trying again to verify those words were indeed from a seventh circle priest of Abadar, I don't suppose you can give me any analysis of what we've just been discussing that sees the world the way a high priest of Abadar would see it.
I am tempted to analyze the dynamics between rulers and the lovers they take, or between men and women more broadly, through the lens of bargaining power, says Tamas, as Carissa, smiling, turns back to her math notes.
Go ahead, Keltham says to the priest.
So she'll expound from a relentlessly business-centric perspective that finds law from the least Dath-Ilani perspective she can conceive of, with the crown of infernal majesty helping, on how in navigating the supply of components or labor it's important which side has the better alternative to a negotiated agreement, and how differently the gains from trade might be distributed depending on that, and how the model can be applied to the hiring process, that is, romance. Though of course Osirians don't really speak of romance so much as of household formation, along with some speculation about how Avestani gender norms are the consequence of a persistent deficit of men due to the way wars were fought in Avestan a few centuries ago, differing from how they were fought in Garand, producing a population with more women than men, and where the strategy of holding out for marriage was outcompeted.
And the combined powers of half of Project Lawful have finished both Asmodea's question and Carissa's. They know now how to solve problems together that they could not solve alone. They can give Carissa the outline of the solution path, down to the most plausible of the false leads they followed, and she need only write it at whatever speed she thinks Keltham will find plausible. Asmodea is doing the same, with her own problem, in between looking over the Shadow Project's individually generated notes on a conspiracy of Project Lawful Girls to see what the statistical structure there should look like, how much commonality and how much difference there is. She'll be able to correct soon any relative anomalies in the main Project Lawful's stories of what they think the conspiracy would look like. They're all working on their stories now, without waiting, of course. Asmodea doesn't let herself think that maybe the worst is past, because tropes.
That does seem like the sort of analysis he'd have expected from a seventh circle priest of the business god. It's not even giving him the feeling of staleness, of not seeing the new information he was really looking for, that he got from the earlier parts of the expedition. So why is Keltham feeling not so great about the whole thing? Because it's something that Carissa and Asmodea working together could plausibly have composed. He tried to run a safeguard against that. This should be some evidence for Ordinary, at the end of it, even if it's not decisive. What was Ordinary supposed to do? He should think of that later, after it's too late for them to read his mind and do it.
Carissa turns in her completed problem before Asmodea does, and while the priest is in the middle of a particularly detailed and clever discussion of the different incentives which produced norms of large harems among rulers in Casmeron and not among rulers in Avestan.
At which point Keltham realizes that he's gotten around as much evidence as he's going to get here. He tells the priest they're done, and tells Fenalosa to go look for whatever accessible library he thinks would have the largest flaming Chelish history section they can find. And it would be nice if Keltham could buy or borrow books from that library.
Fenalosa has no idea where the libraries in Absalom are? Is it okay if he asks people?
He can even pay people. Fenalosa has free rein on this one. Ordinary Cheliax can put its best foot forwards here.
All right, then, he'll go to the front desk of the Abadar Temple and offer to pay for a list of suggestions with extra money if the top suggestion is the same as the top suggestion of some other people he asks. And then he'll go out and over to the Nethesian Temple and ask them too, god of knowledge, after all. And then the Temple of Iomade, who is, after all, a Chelish ascended human.
Keltham is trying not to think of how he plans to check things.
Is planning to read ahead more than one page this time. Do other spot checks around the book.
Cheliax has some magic text editing items by now, and Corva Talandria has been working hard behind the scenes with basically all of the Imperial book editors in Cheliax to re-prepare for this. It's down to her then. Nobody tell Talandria that. It won't help.
Even the very early-stage project books that just replace the word Taldor with Cheliax everywhere and change the names of the rulers and cities should be on the shelves for this. They'll pass certain kinds of consistency tests that the other books won't, and Keltham already has low expectations for how much sense books make. And are preparations complete for the Ione Escapes with Keltham version of the Project Collapse plans?
Sigh. Yes. It's not going to work despite Ione trying her hardest, because tropes. Ione wants that very clear before she tries her hardest. None of this, you will pay the price of failure in pain nonetheless bullshit if they want her wholehearted cooperation on playing this out and demonstrating that it can't work even so. Ione is not an Asmodean, and if detect thoughts and truth spells showed she did her best, that's it. No horrible tortures afterwards, okay? Not to mention that Lord Nethys has no doubt arranged for Ione to depart with Keltham when he leaves, so she won't have time to hang around being tortured. No doubt.
Carissa is not planning to have Ione tortured if she tries her best and fails because of the tropes, or because something outside Ione's control did not work out. However, she does not say, they both presumably know perfectly well that if this fails, Carissa, who is an Asmodean, is going to be being tortured and is not going to be making decisions about the disposition of her subordinates. Unless she, too, escapes with Keltham. She is assuming she'll receive orders from the Most High or from the Queen about that. It seems awfully dangerous to think about herself, with this headband on, and security probably extremely twitchy about dominating her on the spot if she thinks something like that she might, hypothetically, if she fled to Osirion with Keltham at some future point defect. And the person deciding whether Carissa should flee with Keltham or not should not be unable to think about that.
Rugaton will consider whose call that should be. Aspexia knows she does not have a talent for dealing with tropes as story patterns, rather than as a kind of divinity with unshattered prophecy.
Fenelos's faked adventures have gotten him a recommendation for a military academy not too far away. They decided the extra minutes weren't worth the extra bits leaked, which he has been firmly assured by the fake Nethesians carries lots and lots of non-military history too, because politics and economics and social policy considerations are highly relevant to the military, and because it's a Nethesian-affiliated academy and aims to, by its enormous library, attract lots of wizards who mostly want to learn, but are persuadable to defend Absalom and or the world when relevant.
This lets them throw in a ton of bona fide writing on the Chelish armed forces, which adds some bulk at minimal risk.
While this was going on, Asmodia finished her own math problem, and Keltham collected the Project Lawful conspiracy theories, even though the 30 minutes weren't up, and Keltham glance-skimmed everything to try to fix the information content, though he didn't have anything like time to read it all. Keltham does not really get the military academy has the best library concept, but it is not outside his general range of Galarian weirdness, and there's no obvious reason the conspiracy would do that. If Fenelosa thinks this is Ordinary's best foot forwards, let's try it.
If you wish to support this AI reading and others like it, please visit patreon.com/AskWhoCastsAI. Any help is appreciated. And thank you to executive producer John Doe 7776059